The Fitterist Show with your host, Christopher Allen, where we explore the art of mind and body conditioning. In this week's episode, we take a look at a couple of stories in the health, wellness, and nutrition area from the past week. First up, we check out a very interesting study that examines the timing of when one consumes their meals and its impact on overall health and obesity. So it's really the when you eat versus what you eat. Next, we take a look at a study that examined the cardiovascular and other health benefits of exercise among older adults in particular, and helps to answer the question, how old is too old to exercise? So let's dive in. This first study is really a combination of a couple of different studies that really talks about changes in dietary habits and what time of the day you should eat more so than what you actually eat. So the when versus the what. Not that the what's not important, but again, these studies focused more on the timing of food consumption throughout the day. And they start by positing that there's really been several changes in the dietary habits in the last 30, 40 years, where really the genesis of the obesity epidemic began. First, there was the change in what we were recommended to eat. And if you remember, the dietary guidelines were still emerging. We're learning about foods and their impact on the body, and there wasn't really any hardline dietary advice. You basically, as a kid, and I grew up in this era, you ate what your mom told you to eat. When your mother said, have an apple, you had an apple. And there weren't a plethora of other things in the cupboard to eat. From a government perspective, we were basically at a high level told to cut out the fat in our diets way down and replace that with carbohydrates. As we learned, not necessarily the best advice. The second change is really around eating patterns. And this is from the National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey back in 1977, found that most people ate 3 times per day. Breakfast, lunch, dinner. No surprises there. There was essentially very little snacking. There wasn't the after-school snack. There wasn't the mid-morning, mid-afternoon snack. There wasn't the, hey, I need something before I go to bed snack. It was really pretty much breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Fast forward about 30, 35 years to the mid-2000s, and now things had changed. Mid-morning snacks, after-school snacks, intra-athletic activity snacks, before bedtime snacks became much more commonplace. And big food was right there to fuel that increasing consumption of snackable foods with marketing and advertising campaigns in support of all these new food lines that were now snackable. Large-scale surveys show that from the early 90s until the late 2000s, so 90 to 2009, the percentage of children and adults who regularly snack has virtually skyrocketed. Among children aged 13 to 18, those who engaged in snacks went from 8.7% to 46%. That's a 5x plus increase. And adults showed a very similar rise. They went from about 8.7%, which is same as kids, right? They're eating at the same time, breakfast, lunch, and dinner. But they skyrocketed to about 36%. And this is not really just a U.S. phenomenon. There's global implications to this too. Other countries like China has also had major increases in snacking between meals. And this is where the what you eat comes into play. So I don't want to think that snacking is taboo and it is evil and completely detrimental. It's not necessarily true, but what those big food companies are creating for, quote, snackable, even in the titles of some of the food, is arguably a bit questionable. To further provide evidence, there was another U.S. study done on current eating habits, and this was done back in 2015, and it was tracked via a smartphone app. So the 10% of people who ate the least frequently ate about 3.3 times a day, pretty close to that breakfast, lunch, and dinner. But that obviously means that 90% of people ate more than 3.3 times per day. In fact, the top 10% of the people in this study with the smartphone app ate an astounding 10 times per day. Essentially, they started eating as soon as they got up and didn't stop until they went to bed. One of the key metrics that this study actually tracked was what they called the median daily intake duration. So this is basically the amount of time from when you first start eating something to when you last stop eating something. So it doesn't mean it's a continuous eating binge. It's just the time from when you first start eating in the day to when you eat your last thing before you go to bed. And what they found was that duration was about 14.75 hours per day. So to put it in kind of chronological context, if you start eating breakfast at 8 a.m., you basically didn't stop eating your eating window until 10:45 p.m. Again, that doesn't mean you were eating from 8 a.m. to 10:45 p.m. consistently. It just means you started eating and consuming at 8 o'clock and you finished your consumption for the day at 10:45. So that span of time, 14.75 hours. And basically that kind of means the only time you're really not eating is when you're sleeping. And this is contrasting with the, again, pre-obesity epidemic surge from the 1970s, where you had basically breakfast at 8 a.m., dinner at 6 p.m. That duration is roughly 10 hours. Another interesting finding of the study was that there was a noticeable bias toward late night eating. So a lot of people aren't hungry when they first wake up in the morning, but this study found that about 25% of calories are taken before noon, but 35% of the calories consumed were after 6 p.m. Obviously, the implications here are that you have less time to burn off any fat or extra calories ingested late at night because you're basically doing nothing before you go to bed. Whereas if you consume something early in the day, you have time to at least go for a walk, and you just burn your natural metabolic rate throughout the day. In that same study, one of the things they did is they took a subset of people who were overweight that were eating, had that duration span of more than 14 hours per day in which they were consuming food, and they were just instructed to curtail that eating time to only 10 or 11 hours. And what happened was those people actually lost weight. They lost about 7 pounds and felt better, even though they weren't really instructed to overly change when they ate. They just had to change the window of time and compress it so that they're eating calories within a more time-restricted window. So essentially, this is a little bit of a flavor of intermittent fasting that we talked about before. In a similar vein, another study compared a regular eating schedule to an optimized time-restricted feeding schedule. So both intermittent fasting and time-restricted eating tend to produce some reduction in food intake, and therefore it's never quite clear what the benefits of these strategies are due to timing. So what they did is they took a group of the participants who were men with pre-diabetes conditions, and there were kind of two prongs of the study, where they changed the eating window between 8 a.m. and 8 p.m., and then also employed with that same group of people an early time-restricted feeding from 8 a.m. to 2 p.m. Both groups ate 3 meals a day of the same foods. So what they did is they split them up into two groups. Some would start with the conventional diet, 8 a.m. to 8 p.m., and then cross over to the 8 a.m. to 2 p.m., and the other group did the opposite. And they were separated by a 7-week kind of clean-out period. So your body had time to come back to a state of normalization before you entered into the next phase of the trial. Again, the main variable at play here is simply the restricted time feeding and ending that feeding period at 8 p.m. or at 2 p.m. And the benefits of this study they found were huge. The mean insulin levels dropped significantly, insulin resistance dropped, and remember, insulin is a driver of obesity, so just changing the meal timing and restricting the number of hours in which you can eat, and then moving to an earlier eating schedule produced big benefits, even in the same person eating the same meals. So even more remarkable was that after that 7-week clean-out period, that early time-restricted feeding group, so the group that ended at 2 p.m., they maintained that lower insulin levels at the baseline. So the benefits were maintained even after stopping the time restriction. They also had a drop in blood pressure. Perhaps even more interesting, you might be asking, well, if I had to stop eating at 2 p.m., wasn't that group just ravenous at night? And the study actually found with those participants with restricted late night eating actually had a lower desire to eat and also a lower capacity to eat when they engaged in the time-restricted behavior. So somewhat counterintuitively, right, you wouldn't think that restricting eating at 2 p.m. would produce more feelings of fullness in the evening. The researchers found that it took participants on average about 2 weeks to adjust to this new way of eating. So it's one of those things where if you start it and it doesn't work on day one, don't quit, because your body takes time to adapt and adjust. It can take even longer than that was average of 2 weeks. It can easily, some participants took 3 or 4 weeks to adjust, but most found the fasting period relatively easy to adhere to with that time restriction. So the bottom line of all the research is this: we really focus obsessively on the question of what to eat. Should I have this or should I have that? Should I eat white rice or should I eat pasta? Should I not eat carbohydrates? Should I eat more fat? Should I eat less fat? Should I eat more protein, less protein? What form of protein? Should I do protein powders? And there's studies going on all the time, and the answer changes every so often, depending on who you ask and what you read. But this study, I think, found an equally important question that not as many people talk about, and that is, what is the effect of meal timing have on food consumption, metabolic parameters, links to obesity? In this study, at least, it would imply that there's quite a lot. Having a well-defined fasting period is likely very important. And the intermittent fasting concept generally gives people who have exhausted many other dieting options maybe a new hope and a new chance to improve their overall health. I'll include links to the studies and some of the supporting graphs in the show notes at www.fitterus.com/038 for episode 38. There's some fascinating stuff in here. It's worth checking out. And now on to story number 2. This next story is about getting to the gym as you age. It's a very recent study. It was released in November of 2019, and researchers looked at over 1 million men and women age 60 years and older, given 2 consecutive health checks from 2009, 2010, and 2011, 2012. During each of the health checks, they were asked questions about their lifestyle, physical activity level, and they calculated the amount of moderate and vigorous exercise participants did each week and any changes between the health checks. So this is a Korean study, and a little over 20% of inactive seniors at the first check had increased their physical activity by the second, according to the study. And these people experienced reduction in cardiovascular disease as well. Perhaps not as surprising, the research found that increasing physical activity, even in your golden years, reduces the risk of heart disease and stroke. And they really weren't surprised that cardiovascular health benefits and exercise among older adults leads to overall better health and lower incidence of heart disease, diabetes, and stroke. So the researchers really focused on A, the age of the people, and 2, what was the level of activity. And so they found, again, these are all the participants are age 60 years or older, so it's never too late to improve things regardless of your age. And the second thing is they concluded, based on all of the health check logs, that the level of activity needed to experience the benefit was equal to about 1 hour of running per week. Now, granted, people did a lot of different activities, but if they had to boil it down to one kind of digestible format, it is equivalent to 1 hour of running per week. That's very doable. Even those who were disabled or living with chronic conditions who switched from being inactive, which was a good chunk of the people, to being moderately active at least 3 times per week, significantly reduced their risk of cardiovascular problems and the health markers associated with those measurements. Just as an example, people living with diabetes, high blood pressure, or elevated cholesterol levels reduced their risk by up to 7%. And on the converse, there was also a segment of participants who said that they exercised at least 5 times per week at the first screening, but had slid and become basically inactive by the time of the second screening. In these individuals, it was found that they increased their risk of cardiovascular problems by about 27%. So the findings really are aligned with what the Health and Human Services documentation around physical activity and its benefits, and the belief that physical activity is associated with a reduction of cardiovascular disease, and that activity is the key. Literally, anyone, any age, should just routinely stimulate the heart and lungs so that the heart rate increases, breathing rate increases, and stimulating those systems will reduce the risk of cardiovascular disease, like heart attacks, strokes, and reduces even some cancer risks and general mortality. So an interesting study whose premise is basically you're never too old to get moving. And if you haven't been physically active, no time like the present to start. Overall, people 60 years and older who exercised reduced their risk of cardiovascular disease by 11%, and those who did the opposite and became sedentary raised their risk of cardiovascular disease by 27%. So even people that had disabilities, chronic conditions, benefited from exercise. Of course, as always, it's a good idea to speak with your healthcare professional before beginning any exercise routine, particularly as you get older, to just make sure you're finding the best way to proceed for your age, your fitness level, and any anomalies you might have. But get in there and start, or keep working out if you're already doing it. With that, I'd like to thank you for taking the time to listen to The Fitterist Show. You can follow us on Instagram at FitteristMindBody and on Twitter at FitteristMind. If you enjoyed this episode, please send it to a friend or subscribe to make sure you don't miss any future episodes of The Fitterist Show. My name is Christopher Allen, and make it a magical day.